far more, and to speak about how animal agriculture is far more devastating to the environment than people realize. It's one of the most impactful things that we do. Now, these are some people that I've worked with in Haiti, and my good friend Sam, who's in the bottom right corner there, who I manage the schools with. He's an essential part of that team. The world population, we grow at about 1%, and that doesn't sound like a lot. But when you start with 7 billion people, now 8 billion people, it means that you're adding 1 billion people to the world every 10 to 12 years, and that's what's been happening. We're supposed to reach 10 billion people by 2050, and there's a lot of misinformation around world population, but United Nations data and demographers say that by 2021, we're going to have 10 to 13 billion. It can even be a little bit less or a little bit more than that, or a lot less or a lot more, depending on very small changes in fertility rates can have big impacts on future population. Now, when you look at the number of humans and the amount of livestock that we have on the world, most people don't know these figures. In fact, the weight of our livestock, our vertebrate livestock, or let's just talk about our mammals on Earth. They outweigh, and it's humans plus mammals that we breed, that is our livestock, outweigh wild mammals by more than 25 times. Okay, depending on the data you look at, is 25 to 100, times the amount of weight. Okay, and chickens on Earth, just one species, outweigh all species of wild birds. There are 15 to 20,000 species of wild birds, depending on how you define a species. And one species that we have bred into existence outweighs all of them by 3 times. In the last 50 or so years, the human population has doubled, okay? And our livestock population has also more than doubled. And the wild animal populations that are tracked by the WWF and Royal Zoological Society in this case have been cut by more than half. We are in a very, very steep decline of wild animals and biodiversity on Earth. We have appropriated about 75% of the land-based environment on Earth, okay, that we've significantly altered. 2/3 of the marine environment is altered by us. 3/4 of all freshwater systems are devoted to human use, mainly crop and livestock. And there's been a dramatic increase in crop production, much of which really goes to animal agriculture. The world's biomass, everything green that grows on Earth, has been cut in half by humans, mainly deforestation, but also loss of wetlands, etc. We've cut biomass of everything green on Earth. And we control 1/4 of everything that green that grows on Earth, all right? We've cut down more than half of the world's forests, and we've cut down far more than half of the world's large trees because we selectively go after the large trees. Agriculture occupies about 50% of the Earth's non-frozen surface, but agriculture for food production about 40%, okay? And what we see here is an ecological genocide. And I like to call it an ecological genocide because it is indeed a genocide. We are annihilating all of these species. We're in the 6th mass extinction right now, if you must have heard of. And we're sort of dominating like the Earth. Now, most people don't see it as being that bad because we live in our own sort of bubbles, in our cozy areas where we live in the city or our homes and everything like that. So that's our sort of lived experience. But the experience of our consumption, where we extract everything from around the world, that's global. So we may buy an item. It could be some food or a cell phone or build a house or something like that. The materials come from all over the country, all over North America, all over the world. But we only see the final product here and where we live. We don't see the impact of everywhere that it's been extracted from. Now, when you're talking about animal agriculture, we have to look at something called the feed conversion ratio. All right. This is a key concept as to why animal agriculture has a higher impact on the environment than plant-based agriculture. Under the most optimal conditions, if you have the most optimally bred chickens with the most optimal feed, with the most optimal temperatures and everything like that you do, and give them antibiotics, and you do the very hardcore sort of factory farming, you can feed about 3 kilograms of protein to a chicken and then get 1 kilogram back of chicken flesh after you've processed that chicken. And so you're losing about 3 kilograms. You're spending about 3 kilograms of plant food to get 1 kilogram of animal food in terms of protein, sorry, just the protein component of that food back. And there's a waste. But most of the time, it's not perfectly efficient. So conventionally in factory farms, you're going to talk about 3 to 6 grams of plant protein to create 1 kilogram of protein from chicken flesh. And then you can see the different ratios that exist for different animals. And going down the list, there's pigs, and then there's cows and other ruminants. They're the least efficient. Dairy and egg protein, again, are on the order of magnitude as our chickens, and same with fish farming and insects. Even with insects, it's not some slam dunk efficiency. You're losing the amount you have to spend a certain amount of protein to get a smaller amount back. Okay. And therefore, you can use a larger amount of land and water and pesticides and everything that you use that has an impact on the planet to create a smaller amount of protein and edible food back for humans. When you're going organic, or let's say you're grazing the animals, you're not raising these cows in factory farms, they're going to use vastly more amounts of land and have to consume more protein because now they're walking around, burning calories, taking a longer time to grow to their maximum weight, etc. So that is even more wasteful. To make these chickens so efficient, I mean, 3 to 1, like, feed them 3 to 4 kilograms and get 1 kilogram back. Very few life forms on Earth are that efficient, especially when it comes to vertebrate life, when it comes to animals that are running around, moving and doing all that things. We understand our kids eat a lot more protein, or we may eat a lot more protein before we gain that weight ourselves, right, to our body weight as children grow or whatever. But we have bred these chickens through breeding. Sorry, we have genetically modified these chickens through breeding over centuries, and the last few decades. Our breeding programs have become very, very strategic. And in 2005, you can see in 1957, a chicken would grow to a maximum weight of what you see there, about 900 grams. But now we can grow them to 4 kilograms in a very much shorter time than they reached maximum weight in 1957. So you can see that our breeding, and now we also have direct gene modification. Plus we use intensive farming techniques where we don't let them move, we confine them, we use antibiotics, we turn the lights on 24, like for long periods, raise the temperatures, keep these very intense conditions to actually stimulate their growth faster. But despite all of this breeding, you're going to use more land, water, soil, pesticides, antibiotics, fertilizers because of this feed conversion ratio. And currently about 50% of the crops grown in the world are actually fed to animals as animal feed. Okay. We slaughter about 70 to 80 billion land animals per year. That's about 2,000 animals per second, mostly chickens. And because they're the ones that grow the fastest, bred the fastest, and then followed by pigs. Okay. And then there's ruminants, which are cattle, goats, and buffalo, and some other sheep, etc. They graze. We also feed them oil seeds and hay and silage and crops that we grow, but we also graze them. And as I mentioned, the more you graze them, the more inefficient they are. So they take up more land, resources, etc. Okay, and they produce methane. Now, when you graze animals, they produce more methane compared to those that are confined in factory farms. As I mentioned, those stats about how much of the land we are using, okay? But when it comes to land that we grow crops for direct human consumption, it's actually about 7% of the Earth's surface that are used to grow crops that we directly eat ourselves. And if you're looking at the protein crops, so beans and lentils, nuts, seeds, and let's say grains or whole grains, that's smaller than 7%, right? Because there's also lettuce and cucumbers and all kinds of foods that we don't consume so much for the protein. That's all grown on that 7% of the land. But we grow, all of our protein foods for direct human consumption on a very small portion of land compared to animal agriculture. Yet, plant-based agriculture provides more than 60% of the protein that we eat. Okay. And animal agriculture, despite its vast use of land and everything else, provides only 40% of the protein that is eaten by humans. Grazed animals, ruminants, provide about 1.2% of the world's protein. Those are grazed. There's other ruminant animals that are factory farmed. That's in addition. You can find a lot of this data on the website Our World in Data. This is a slide that I borrowed. So from a very, very tiny percentage of the world's land, we're able to provide more than half of the protein of humans through plant-based agriculture. It's very much more efficient, exponentially more efficient. When it comes to deforestation, we all know about the Amazon, but it's also everywhere else. The biggest cause of deforestation, loss of wetlands, et cetera, is animal agriculture, because that's the single greatest use of land by humans for anything that we do. Okay. And most of the crops, people say, hey, soy is bad because it's deforestation. Well, that's because most of that soy is fed to animals rather than the very tiny percentage that's consumed by humans directly. That part is very efficient, right? Even if it's not active deforestation, animal agriculture occupies large tracts of land that could otherwise be natural ecosystems. So land use in every case is ecosystem destruction, and grazing and growing crops to feed animals is the biggest cause of deforestation globally, occupation of land that would otherwise be forested, even if it's not being actively deforested, rainforest loss, wetlands loss, loss of natural grasslands, and ultimately biodiversity loss. Grazing compared to factory farming is far less efficient, creates far more methane, okay? But at the same time, factory farming may be worse for animal welfare and creates more antibiotic resistance. But overall, grazing will have the highest amount of ecological impact simply because using the most land releases more methanes. And remember also that almost all pretty much all the land that's used for grazing in North America and many other parts of the world is through the colonial process, where we've annihilated indigenous people and taken the land from them in order to occupy that land. Grazing people will tell you that, oh, we're so good for the environment. There's all kinds of stuff right now about, oh, regenerative grazing, but it's mostly marketing and it's mostly kind of falsifications of the real world situation. Everywhere that you have grazing, you're going to have changes in the natural vegetation. You can have soil compaction, erosion, desertification. Native birds, the animals, reptiles, mammals will be affected. There's going to be variations place to place. You're going to annihilate any animal that comes in your way in the same land where you want to graze animals. In Africa, they're going to kill off lions. Over here, you might be killing off groundhogs or antelope or elk and wolves are always going to be slaughtered anywhere that grazing happens. And there's a lot of animal waste that contaminates water, and that's the story of grazing. But at the same time, you have this tremendous marketing of grazing right now by the meat industry, because the meat industry knows how to do marketing. They're a $1 trillion industry. They have hundreds of billions that they use for advertisements, marketing in all kinds of media forms, television advertisements, print media, but also social media. And they hire their own and pay their own researchers and everything like that to create kind of misinformation, even in the scientific space. We have an article from Plant-Based Data talking about how, sort of with analysis, one of the major articles put out by these academics that are funded by the meat industry, and we see the sort of the standard things that they do across the board in order to sort of try to tell you that meat is in fact, good for the environment, right? They'll just tell the opposite story. And these are the kind of things you find in all kinds of industries, whether it's the plastics industry, the nuclear industry, the fossil fuel industry, and everything else, the flame retardant chemical industry. They're all trying to create research and misinformation and say that what we're doing is actually better rather than worse. Animals use more water than plants do because you're growing a large number of crops to feed to animals rather than a small number of crops to then directly feed humans. Okay, 70 to 80% of all the soy in the world is fed to humans, and only about 6% is for direct human consumption. Much of that is oil, but if you just look at people consuming soy as like a whole food, like tofu or soy milk or anything like that, it's, probably 2 to 3% of all soy production is just for human consumption. And that's a very efficient crop and really good for you. Fertilizers, water pollution, and runoff of fecal matter goes into water systems, causes eutrophication in rivers and lakes, and ultimately these things filter to the ocean, cause the same problems there. They also create a lot of different bacteria that affect humans. If you get sick traveling in India or drinking water somewhere, a lot of times it's because of the bacteria that are present due to animals, livestock, fecal matter getting into the water. There's lots of soil erosion from these animals walking around, trampling the soil, et cetera, and the aggressive growing of crops to feed animals as well. And there's large dead zones in freshwater and marine ecosystems as a result of this. And water and rivers that are literally drained in order to irrigate land to create feed to feed animals, right? When it comes to climate change, there's a lot of information out there that there's a spectrum that where some people calculate as little as 14% of greenhouse gas emissions are caused by animal agriculture. The United Nations initially came up with a number of 18%, then it was downgraded to 14% when a lot of animal agriculture people became involved in the revision of this data. Others have calculated up to 51%. And it always depends on what parts of the emissions and what areas and land use changes that you're including in the calculation. And the truth is probably somewhere in between the lowest and the highest figures there. Maybe around 30% of greenhouse gas emissions likely come from animal agriculture. And you can see from our world in data, good information about how much greenhouse gas emissions come from different forms of animal products and plant foods. Okay, and you can see along the bottom there that when you're eating getting your protein from whole grains or tofu or nuts and seeds and stuff like that, the emissions per gram of protein or per 100 grams of protein is very, very much small, and in some cases can even be the negative. When you look at animal agriculture, of course, not all beef production or lamb production or any kind of food production, plant-based foods too, is going to be the same. So you see a distribution of like how much greenhouse gas emissions are coming from any particular source. And there's more information there again from our world in data. I've already showed this slide. I'm not going to go over it again. Now, when it comes to fish, back in 1950, we would take about 20 million tons of fish from the oceans. But now there's about 140 million tons taken from the ocean and 60 million tons from aquaculture that is going to humans. And there's a large amount of what we call IUU fishing, illegal, unregulated, undocumented. I would recommend the movie called Seaspiracy for everyone. Most of the data in that movie is actually very good. We fish about 2.5 trillion fish per year. Okay, and that means about 25,000 to 70,000 fish are taken from the ocean per second. Okay, because we are more than 7 billion people. We're now just officially 8 billion people as of just a few months ago. And the biggest form of ecosystem disruption in the ocean is fishing itself. Okay, we are wiping out populations of fish from the ocean. There's 33% of the ocean that they say is fished at unsustainable levels and 60% maximally fished. But even that maximum fishing means that you've depleted more than half of the fish life in those areas of ocean. And again, fishing industry itself dominates the ecological certifications that you see on fish products. So they're just blue washing everything. Basically, they make up their own stuff and make up their own labels and certify themselves as being eco. Basically, it's a marketing scam, just like many other industries do in the food or non-food sectors. When it comes to bycatch, there is so much bycatch. The biggest reason that we're killing off sharks and whales and all kinds of seabirds, etc., is because our fishing nets and all of our other mechanisms are killing everything in the ocean. They don't just take the target fish. And there's a military competition over the oceans. And even academic journals and people like that get lobbied and somehow fooled into thinking this kind of stuff is sustainable, even when there's lots of data showing to the contrary. Fishing gear presents more than 20% of the ocean plastic that's out there. In some areas, like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, you've heard of these gyres, they make up more than 40% of the garbage of plastic waste in those oceans. Most fishing industry, when the fishing nets get old, it's way too much work to haul them back up and bring them on shore. The cheapest, easiest things to do is just cut them and leave them in the ocean. Nobody knows better. And these abandoned, lost fishing gear, discarded fishing gear, what they call ALDF, they are some of the deadliest plastics in the ocean that continue to wipe out wildlife. And when we do these things like banning straws, these are just, plastic industries trying to create distractions and make you feel like they're doing something when they're actually not doing anything. The biodiversity loss and extinction in the world is tracked by three big organizations. I mentioned one of them, the Royal Society and WWF. The other is the UN Red List, and the last is the IPBES, it's this organization over here. Sorry, I'm going to go through the proper name of it, but they all identify animal agriculture as being a leading cause of biodiversity loss. And right now, out of 11 million species, there's about 1 million species that are threatened. These include many of the iconic species that we know, the giraffes and lions and elephants and so many others that we love, bears of all kinds, that are extremely threatened by animal agriculture and everything else that we're doing. And but also like the monarch butterfly and everything else. We are causing extinction of animals, of plant life, insects, all kinds, extinction of ecosystems. We're wiping out ecosystems. And animal agriculture is probably the biggest cause of all, because we have the greatest amount of impact on this very wide scale. But of course, there are multiple correlated problems. It's not just animal agriculture. It's also combined with our overpopulation, our material economy, our pollutants, climate change, roads, urban design, et cetera, that's fragmenting and destroying the global environment. When it comes to large animals meaning more than 100 pounds, okay, there are 362 species that weigh more than that. 70% are in severe decline and 59% at risk of extinction, and hunting and loss of habitat are the two biggest causes, okay? And they sort of go hand in hand. A lot of time there's habitat loss or roads that infiltrate different areas as grazing and so forth progresses. And then people then use those roads to go and then hunt other animals. But again, of course, it's multiple impacts. When it comes to global food security, one thing we should, a stat from one paper is that if everybody converted to having a plant-based diet, let's say overnight, an additional 4 billion people could be fed from the same farmland that we're currently using if it was just converted for plant use as opposed to for animal feed. That's far in excess of the number of people on Earth that you would need to feed. Now, that doesn't mean that people would automatically get the food if people started being plant-based, because there's all kinds of inequity out there and poor distribution and multiple issues. But it just shows that you can grow a much larger amount of food on a much smaller area of land if you're going plant-based. And that affects the supply of food that we have globally. And one of the biggest problems is this food injustice, where what happens is that we use the richer people in the world and the richer countries in the world use most of the food, the land and water to grow food or graze animals that becomes animal products, and it's diverted towards the global rich, okay? And it means there's less for the global poor who don't afford those products. And there's a lot of land grabbing, and everything else that's going on in this process. Biofuels present the same problem, by the way, but to a lesser extent. So what's the solution? How can a plant-based diet help the environment? Essentially, it comes back to the fact that you need far, far, far less land to grow the same amount of food. And that means all that land that you were using for animal agriculture, that we are using for animal agriculture, could be rewilded. You can allow it to become a forest, a wetland, a grassland, or try to get it as close to the original environment it was prior to human intervention. And that's not always easy to do. It doesn't mean that you get the same species back automatically if you just let the land free from human use. But there are different ways of trying to optimize a rewilding process. And that in itself is a science. What I tell people is to love your plant proteins. Okay, pulses are 20% protein. So pulses meaning all the beans and lentils that we eat. They're about 20, sometimes up to 30% protein. Soy can be 30 to 40% protein. And basically, there's 1/100th of the greenhouse gas emissions compared to beef, and 1/10 compared to chicken. They create their own nitrogen. They fix it from the air and put it into the soil. So they create their own fertilizer and use less artificial fertilizers. And they also help other crops grow. When you do intercropping, the lentils will help other crops grow beside them. And there's the concept of the three sisters. Indigenous people throughout the Americas, South, Central, and North America, grew the three sisters, beans, corn, and squash. And the beans would fertilize the other two, and the corn would provide a stock for the beans, and the squash would cover the ground to prevent other other non-wanted plants or weeds or whatever you want to call them from growing. The three sisters, okay? And as I mentioned, soy is amazing for humans. It's just not environmental when you feed it to animals as part of the animal agriculture process. The Canada Food Guide, the latest iteration, it was the first iteration that excluded industry from participating in the creation of the food guide, and it's very plant-based, and it's following the science, okay? You can look at the Eat Lancet, which is also an excellent sort of planetary food guide, where they also say that, hey, most of what we eat should be plant-based. And a plant-based diet doesn't mean that you're necessarily vegan. It just means that the majority of the foods that you're eating are from plant sources, whole grains, nuts and seeds, fruits, vegetables, and a small amount of oils, things like spices as well. And that the animal-based foods here are actually optional, all right? So the Eat Lancet Commission wants to know, was trying to answer the question about how do you feed 10 billion people in 2050 while minimizing the ecological damage and also increasing human health, especially things like cancer, diabetes, obesity, and decrease in mortality, okay? So just summing up this part of the presentation, we can see that there is a tremendous impact of animal agriculture on the environment and food justice and food security. And that, you know, the biggest replacement for animal products can be pulses, whole grains, and I should also put nuts and seeds in there. And there's also some things called transition foods like plant-based meats and things that can be used to a lesser extent. So a whole food plant-based diet is better for the environment. Noting that some plant foods may have a high ecological impact, things like palm oil, refined carbohydrates, and packaging, sugars, food waste still has to be taken into consideration, okay? And human rights as well. There's a lot of human rights abuses in the process of animal agriculture, but same with some plant foods, including some chocolate, bananas, and other things as well. Maybe not to the same extent as animal agriculture, but they're still there, and we can talk about them a little bit more. Now, we should know that, I mean, we're coming out of COVID-19, but COVID-19 was created by a form of animal agriculture, because when you bring all these, you know, tens of thousands of animals together, especially multiple species, they're passing viruses around to each other. They're sick, they're stressed, their immune systems are compromised, and you get all kinds of different mutations of these viruses that circulate in these animals that we are unnaturally bringing together. You get variants. Now, some of those variants go on to wipe out large amounts of farmed animals. We see, you know, African swine fever wiping out pig populations across the world, and different types of avian influenzas wiping out bird populations in farms around the world. And literally millions and hundreds of millions of animals in the farming system are dying off as these viruses are continually created and spreading amongst farmed animals. But some of them jump to humans as well. So Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, SARS corona in like the year 2000, that was created by animal agriculture. The swine flu was from animal agriculture maybe 10, 15 years before that, HIV, Ebola, the Spanish flu in the early 19th century that wiped out millions of people. These are all a result of animal agriculture. And I have a podcast where I go into this in more detail. And there's a whole section about this on plant-based data. I'm not going to go into too much details because of the time. And I think before I conclude here, concluding some of this stuff here, we can say that plant diet is fundamental to sustainability, and it's also on par in terms of its impact on the materials economy and fossil fuels, et cetera. Now, being plant-based doesn't mean that you can just fly around everywhere in a plane or have large cars and large houses and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't excuse us from other material consumption, because sometimes people say that, hey, I can have a big car and a big house because I'm eating plant-based, but that's not true. Okay, we have to do everything that we can, because we cannot look at these issues in isolation of each other. And we also want to look at, all types of social justice and population and environmental or economics, the type of economics and overconsumption, governments, peace and war, and all these things. And there's Greta Thunberg. Now, one thing I didn't mention enough in our discussion here is the health aspects of plant-based diet. And that is, the major health things from a proper plant-based diet, a whole food plant-based diet, is that we're going to be able to reduce cardiovascular disease, dementia, because that's a big component of dementia, is the vascular component of narrowing arteries and arterioles and blood vessels in the brain, diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and certain types of cancers: breast cancer, prostate cancer, colon cancer, ovarian cancer, certain types of lymphomas. Those are exacerbated more by animal-based animal products consumption, right? And again, defining plant-based diet, it doesn't mean that you're 100% plant-based. It means you're predominantly plant-based. Although I'm 100% plant-based, that's always a great option too, okay? The one thing, if we're eating plant-based, to be careful of is make sure that we're taking our B12. That's the one thing that you can't really get from plant-based foods. But everything else we can get. And we want to but we still want to design our personal diets appropriately to optimize plant-based diets. So we're going to minimize plant-based junk foods, okay? There are lots of them out there, but we want to minimize those. A little tiny bit is okay. And make sure that we're eating plenty of plant proteins and all the different beans and lentils, whole grains, not refined carbohydrates, refined grains, and fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds. And I also like to include a little bit of healthy fats, maybe a little bit of olive oil and flaxseed oil and canola oil, but soybean oil, not too much, but a little bit appropriately can be used of those things too. All right. And that's pretty much it. Now let's see, I have a few more. Yeah, that's it. There's my plant-based data. Just please note that down. There's some of the information I've given here is in much more detail on plant-based data in terms of our summaries and articles that we have there. There's more videos like about the pandemics, et cetera, that I have on plant-based data, and also information and talks about the animal agriculture industry and how they're promoting regenerative grazing, so-called regenerative grazing, and how that actually is just stuff that they're making up mostly, and has actually a worse impact than most common forms of animal agriculture in actuality. So I think that's most of the presentation. I think if I was going to do this again, I would probably throw a few more health slides in there as well, so that we can round it out a little bit better for a general audience. But I hope that's good for starters, and please field me any questions.
I would like to open the field to any questions. If you would like to use put your hand up and we'll call on you.
I can probably stop sharing
right.
my screen. But,
okay,
and show. There we go. So you don't see my screen anymore, right?
Yeah, we do.
You do still? Okay.
Yeah.
We're seeing the four-way test.
You're seeing the four-way test. Okay. I want to